Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on MarshStream, your public performance broadcast platform. My name is Brianna Caver, assistant producer for MarshStream, and we are back again tonight for Solo Arts Heal and Can. Although our theater doors are now back open, there are still some folks unable to attend these live performances. So these free streaming performances are brought to you by patrons just like yourself, all who donate to our tip jar. The link is posted in the chat and is also available on our website at themarsh.org. Remember, all donations are tax deductible and 100% matched. We need you now more than ever so we can continue to bring these free streaming performances to our community. If you are watching us live on YouTube, welcome and thank you for joining us. Please make sure you subscribe to be notified when we go live and watch the hours of free performances, interviews, and events we have archived all right there on our channel. Thursday at the Marsh Berkeley is Wayne Harris's Train Stories at 7:30 p.m. Friday at the Marsh San Francisco is Dan Hoyle's Border People at 7 p.m. Saturday at the Marsh Berkeley is Malia Mills's The Allure of Thug Life at 5 p.m. and Lynn Kaufman's Poetic Justice at 8 p.m. Sunday at the Marsh Berkeley, we have Lynn Kaufman's Poetic Justice at 5 p.m. Again, please donate to our tip jar. Thank you for joining us. And now let's welcome your host, Rick Davis.
Good evening, everybody. And it's a pleasure tonight for us we have the privilege of introducing a man of all trades, a businessman, an entrepreneur, an innovator, a doctor, and many more things that I think we'll uncover. It's my honor to be speaking with Dr. Sam Blackman, who is going to be telling us some stories, and we are in the great company of The Moth. Many of you are familiar, I think, with The Moth, which is a storytelling platform. And I think we have a grand moth here, or a great moth, or what exactly, certainly a high flyer. What sort of moth are you, Sam?
Oh, I'm, clearly some type of evening moth, given the late hours. But no, thank you, Rick. It's a pleasure to be here.
But you have competed in the Moth many times, right? And you have gotten through to higher rounds. And have we heard you on the radio on the Moth?
You have, you may have heard me on the radio. So yeah, I was something of a social introvert for a lot of my life, and never really ever graced any stage that I'm aware of, other than professional speaking or scientific symposia. And about 7 or 8 years ago, my wife and I and another couple went to a Moth Story Slam event in Seattle. Mm-hmm. And I was feeling punchy, I suppose, after a good dinner and a couple of glasses of wine. And so when you walk into these things, they take your ticket and they ask you, "Are you interested in telling a story tonight?" And my wife, of course, was like, "Absolutely not." And I'm like, "Absolutely." And so they're open mic events. So I threw my name in the hat. And my wife was mortified, of course. She's like, "Well, you've never done this before." And I'm like, "Well, that hasn't stopped me before from many things." And she goes, "Well, what are you going to talk about?" I'm like, "I don't know. We'll cross that bridge when we get there." And, sat in my seat, and, they draw the names, out of the hat after every story. And, 3 or 4 stories in, they call my name. And my wife slouches down in her chair, and I'm like, "Oh boy, I better come up with something good." And it was exhilarating for me. And the good thing was I didn't come in last, because I think if I had, I would have been embarrassed and discouraged. I came in sort of 3rd or 4th or something like that, but enough for me for like a switch to flip in me to think, wow, not only did I enjoy that, but I think if I actually worked at it, I could probably be pretty good at it. Mm. So, writing more, something I had done earlier in my career, but had put aside, started writing more personal stories across lots of different domains. And then just learning how to tell a good story. Eventually won some story slams, got invited to compete in some grand slams, won a couple of those. And then actually this year, amazingly, I had a couple of stories on the radio and on the Moth podcast. One last month, a very personal one. I told about my experience with being a sort of a devout Jew when I was a kid, and then being an absolute secular, Jew when I broke up with religion when I was 16. And then one earlier in the year, which is actually a story that I'll tell tonight.
Wow. Yes, I know that devout Jew breaking away story quite well.
It was funny. I live out here in the Pacific Northwest, and I wrote that story for the Grand Slam where I told it. They give you a coach, and so I'm out here in the Pacific Northwest. Was living in Seattle at the time, and the coach that I had was this guy back in Brooklyn, and very New York. So when I rehearsed this story with him, he at the end he goes, "So where are you telling the story?" And I said, "Seattle." And he goes, "Ugh, such a waste." But it's but it turns out that this sort of like schism that I think a lot of people have, particularly if you grew up in a very, like, I grew up conservative Jewish household. If you grow up sort of very devout, and the people who sort of break away, it doesn't matter, Jewish, Catholic, Episcopalians, I suppose, have existential crises. I mean, it happens, and it crosses all religions. It's just a thing that happens to some people, and so I was really pleased afterwards to have folks come up to me and say, yes, I understand this. This is a theme, this realization of your.
I love it. I mean, I always like to say that all religions say really exactly the same thing. It's just depends what sort of flavor you like to take it in. So now, look, we have to tell some stories tonight. We got caught away, so I didn't get to ask you what I wanted to ask you beforehand, but we'll come back to that. I'll let you introduce this first story, since I wasn't able to bring it around in the course of conversation, but we had more fun. Go ahead.
So this is a story that I wrote. I think I probably wrote it in 2018 or 2019. So the way that I sort of write stories is usually prompted by some type of theme, and then my process is I suppose a little unusual in that I'll usually just think about the theme a lot. And most of the time in the shower in the morning, it's where for whatever reason, that is the place where the ideas all seem to come. The theme of that I was writing to was beauty. It's interesting because beauty is not something, as a scientist and as a physician, it's not something that I think about a lot. I'm not a graphic artist of any sort, and the things that I think are beautiful are typically like my daughter or my wife. But I couldn't come up with something, that simple. So I was thinking in the shower about, what have I encountered in my life that was truly beautiful on the professional side. And I remembered something that happened to me when I was a second-year resident in pediatrics. And I wrote this story. I looked in my usual places, in the laboratory, in the labor and delivery ward, in the operating room. But, in the laboratory, microscopic images are mostly just informative or interesting. And in the labor and delivery ward, seeing a child born, if it's not your child, is not beautiful. And, in the operating room, for me, what I saw there amidst the reds and blues was always more brutality than beauty. As a second-year pediatric resident, if there was beauty in medicine, I wasn't finding it. After 80-hour work weeks, frankly, a kid could crap rose petals in front of me, and I'd probably just collect the sample and stick it in a vial and note it in the chart. And don't confuse cute with beauty. Sick kids, even really sick kids, can be cute, but the diseases that they have are not beautiful, and the parents of sick kids are not beautiful. Parents of sick kids are terrified, because when you're scared for the life of your child, you want some element of control, and what you don't want is a second-year resident. And you certainly didn't want me at the time, because between the crushing fatigue and the constant fear of screwing up and feeling like I never knew enough, not only was there no beauty in my world, but I, in fact, was getting uglier. And there were moments where frustration and fatigue got the best of me, and my words hurt the people that I was trying to help. And as someone who so desperately wanted to be a good doctor, I found I was no longer able to be my best self. I was failing. I wasn't the doctor that I had hoped to be. Brianna's mother took this feeling to a whole new level. In fact, the whole team suffered her wrath, and we knew why. Her daughter was dying, and there was nothing that we could do. She had the worst tumor ever, period. Diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, a bastard of a brain tumor. It invades the central part of the brainstem. It's always inoperable. There's no chemotherapy or radiation therapy that can fix it. It's 100% lethal. Most patients only survive about 8 months from their diagnosis. And her fury at the disease and her fury at being a single mother through it came out daily as contempt for us. She'd keep the sliding glass door to her room closed. She'd keep the lights out and the curtains drawn, and wouldn't even let the team in during rounds. She wouldn't let us even examine Brianna. She saw no point. So we'd hover outside the door every morning. We'd discuss the lab results and the clinical plan, and we'd ask to come in and talk to her, but she'd refuse, except when she wanted us to use her treatment plan. Then we'd get to negotiate. Homemade herbal tea? Sure, that's fine. Skip the blood pressure medicines? No, not so fine. Coffee enemas. What about coffee enemas? We had a week-long debate with her mother about coffee enemas because she wanted Brianna to get them. Now, my attending, none of us had ever heard of this, and he asked me to research it. Apparently, it's a thing, really. So, I went to the library, and then he sent me into the room to explain to Brianna's mom why we couldn't let her do this. But because I took her request seriously and presented the arguments and data both for and against, she started to let me in. I mean, really, literally started to let me in. From that day on until I was off service, I was the only doctor that was allowed in the room. And I would examine Brianna, I'd discuss the plan with her mom, and then I'd go out and communicate back to the rest of the team. And so for a few weeks, I was exclusively Brianna's doctor. But then rotations end and residents and teams change, and soon I was off service and on to the next thing. About a month later, my wife and I were driving home from dinner on a Saturday night when my pager went off, and it was a nurse from the Pavilion, which is the far corner of the hospital where the palliative care patients stay. And she thought that Brianna was dying and asked if I would come in. Now, I wasn't on call. I wasn't even on that service, but I sensed that I should be there. So I called the supervising physician on the service, and I asked him to meet me because I'd never attended a death before. And attending a death is far more involved than you'd think. It's not just a matter of waiting around. One of the horrible details that they don't tell you at the start of your pediatric residency is that children take a long time to die. Their hearts and their lungs are strong, and so their bodies fight to hold on to life. And think about that for a moment and what that might look like. It was after 10 o'clock at night, the hall lights were dimmed. The building had that late night quiet that I had always enjoyed about hospitals, but in this remote building and on this particular night, the darkness was a little intimidating. And for the next 4 hours, we did our job. We gave medicines to ease Brianna's agonal breathing and relieve any pain she might be having. And when we could do no more, we stood outside the room and simply bore witness. Middle of the night, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, the nurse checked in the room, and she came out and said that she thought that Brianna had stopped breathing. And the attending physician turned to me and said that I should go in and pronounce her dead because her mother knew me and seemed to trust me. But I had never done this before. I didn't know what to expect. So I quietly entered the room and I whispered that I needed to examine Brianna one last time. And then I carefully performed our ritual. I felt for the lack of a pulse. And I put my stethoscope on her chest and listened for a full 60 seconds for the absence of a heartbeat, and silently noted the time of death and told her mother that I was so sorry for her loss. And then as I was preparing to leave, I stopped and turned back and I said, "Is there anything that I can do for you?" And she thought for a minute and said simply, "Could you pray with me?" And I paused because, well, I'm a lapsed Jew from New Jersey and I don't pray. I don't even really believe in God. And frankly, the death of a child seemed so profoundly unjust that pretending to pray seemed absolutely the wrong thing to do. But right there, in that moment, it finally dawned on me that this was not about me. It wasn't about my feelings. Brianna's mother saw me as her doctor, the one that she needed, and the one that I had always hoped to be. And so there in that dark room, lit by a silent bank of glowing monitors, I had my one truly beautiful moment in medicine, when a stranger took my hand in hers and the two of us stood over the body of her daughter. And I closed my eyes when she did. And when she spoke, words that I had actually only heard a few times before came forth from me too. "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven."
Whoa. Well, I guess it's fortunate that you knew the words.
You pay attention. It was one of those things. I remember the first time I heard that prayer, because when I was growing up, the Bible ended at Deuteronomy. And but had been in Chicago long enough, sort of been around the block long enough that weddings and the like, and I remember the times that I'd been in a church and I heard that prayer, and it's the words are really, they resonate. I mean, they're just deeply affecting.
Oh yeah.
They stick in your they sort of stick in your brain, independent of sort of whatever religion you subscribe to. So but yeah, it was a really remarkable human moment, and one where I think ordinarily I would have just sort of left that room and not really looked back. But one of those moments where you could actually just stop and hear what a patient's family needs from you.
And this story was written when?
Oh gosh, probably, I don't know, 2018, 2019. It was written, many years after
Right.
it happened this is probably 15 years later. But I just sort of carried this around with me for a long time.
Right.
It was the first time that it wasn't the first time I'd watched somebody die, but it was the first time, I had been the person to, the ritual of pronouncing somebody dead is, I think, more of just that it's a ritual. There's nothing to it really. You just make sure that the person's really dead. But it's a ritual with weight to it. And I think the first time you do that, it sticks with you. Just as a young physician in training, you just feel the significance of that moment in time for, the person who's passed away and the people that have been left behind. Yeah, and you just carry it around with you, like many things.
So the reason I asked you that is because there was a very long period between the time when that happened and the time when you wrote that story. And one of the reasons that we have this show is to talk about how the arts help you in terms of dealing with your own situation, your own condition, your own illness, your own anxieties, your own fears. Before you were a storyteller, were you an artist in any other way, shape, or form? An artist. I mean,
No, not in any formal sense. I mean, no. I mean, I don't think I actually understood. I mean, look, I can't draw to save my life. I remember when I was in graduate school, I had a night job where I was teaching college biology at a local college in Chicago that mostly focused on art and communication. And I would draw like stick figures for people, and the students would all just laugh like hysterically because I couldn't draw to save my life. I still can't draw to save my life. I can't paint. I can't, sculpt. I can't sing. I mean, I can sing. I just sing very badly. But I can
in
write.
the shower in the morning when you're composing stories, right?
But I can write, and I never set out to like purposefully to. I was never trained as a creative writer or anything like that. But when I was an oncology fellow, I would just come home every night and I would write about what happened that day, and I would associate sort of what I had experienced that day with a song that I had heard or with a piece of art that I had seen or something, and I would just try and get the thoughts out on paper because I think when you're a trainee in medicine, if you're paying attention, it's like going and eating like an incredibly rich meal every single night, and it's hard to digest sometimes. And for me, at least, getting what I was experiencing out on paper every night just helped me digest the things that I was experiencing, the things that I was seeing. It was more than I was capable of processing, mentally or emotionally or spiritually on any given day. And I just, would sort of park those stories on paper and then they just sit. But no, I'm not an artist, but I'm a reasonable writer.
Well, I don't think you do yourself justice, because the mere fact that you had the discipline or the need, as it may have been, to come home and to spill those feelings onto a piece of paper is very much in the spirit of what we talk to everybody on Solo Arts Heal about, which is how the arts have helped you. And the arts in this case were creative writing, and the fact that you didn't perform them doesn't matter to me, or to most people. But for you, it was an important element for you it was a cathartic element for you to get some of these feelings out. Is that fair?
That's absolutely fair. It's funny, when I remember after my residency, I moved to Boston to do my oncology fellowship, and during the orientation week, there were a lot of things that happened that orientation week that just took me by surprise. I mean, the way that it works in medicine is, you start residency, they literally are like, we're going to give you some basic orientation, and then guess what? You're the doctor. And even more so for subspecialty training. So I'd left Cincinnati on like a Friday, drove to Boston in a couple of days, and showed up at Dana-Farber on a Monday. And they're like, all right, we're going to teach you in a week how to be a pediatric oncologist. And I'm like, oh, wow. And one of the things they did sort of towards the end of that week is they gave us a name in an envelope, and they said, this is the name of your psychiatrist. And I'm like, did you know that I was crazy coming in here, or were you just being like well prepared? They're like, no. We assign a psychiatrist to every new. because you will need them. And I'm like, I will not. Like, no, I will not. And what's amazing is maybe 2 months in, 3 months in, you're really in it. You're the kids that you've been assigned to, or the new diagnoses that you're accountable for. The kids are starting to get really sick, or you start to see a couple of patients die and stuff like that. And the first time you like sort of go through this, it's a big deal. And like, you're on call every third night or every fourth night, and it's bad. It's really hard. And by like October, I was really struggling. And I had one of a little girl who I'd taken care of who died. And it just broke me. And I remember getting the envelope and calling the number. And I went over to Brigham and Women's and sat down with the psychiatrist, and I was just rambling. I'm like, I don't know why I'm here, and blah, blah, blah. And then literally 10 minutes in, I was just hysterical, because I just, everything that I had taken in over 4 or 5 months was just being vomited out of me all at once.
Right.
It was
Right.
And so after that, I'm like, well, I can't be like an emotional bulimic, like taking all this stuff in and then vomiting it out.
Right.
A giant mess. And that's when I really started writing. And it was just sort of like, I'm going to experience the day and all the victories and all the defeats, and oftentimes more defeats than victories, and the things that I did that worked well and the things that I did that worked poorly. And then I'm just going to write down, like, what made me feel something today, and why, and try and just, why am I thinking about this one kid, or why am I thinking about this one dad, or this one mom, or this one thing that I saw? And it helped a lot. It really did. Every single, just a little bit helped a lot.
So, did you keep the stories?
I'm sure they're sitting on a computer somewhere. I'm sure they are somewhere in the deep. Not everything was a story. There were some things that that just got lost over time. And 10, 15 years later, when I started writing seriously to perform, I just would sort of troll in the memory banks, what was still there, what was I carrying around with me. Not everything that I write is about medicine. I'd say half of the things that I write about are things out of the hospital. The rest is life stuff. It's, I had a very contentious relationship with my father, spanning many decades. There's a lot about that. There's a lot about my daughter. We had a really fascinating journey to bring her home from Kazakhstan, which is where she was born. And that whole process of bringing a child from the other side of the world over here, what that means for her, what that means for us. So, I write about things that make me sort of step back with a little bit of awe and wonder. I fly to the other side of the world, and they give me a human, and I get to bring her back home. Like, that's noteworthy. Like, that's something fascinating to write about. Like, how does that happen? Why does that happen? Why this human being? And what does it mean for her? What does it mean for us? Or, my father, who's a pediatrician, who for the first 10 years of my life, I wanted to be just like him. And then for the second 10 years of my life, I wanted to be nothing like him. And what that journey was like, because somehow I ended up in the middle, a little bit like him, but not so much. And, who am I in that context is definitely something to write about.
We have a previous Solo Arts Heal that I really think you should listen to, by a woman who I can't remember what her art was. I think she was an actress. John will remember. John Ivory will certainly remember, who traveled a long way for insemination. To Ukraine, I think it was. And it's a very good story. So we'll figure out, and we'll send it to you. They basically did what you did, but in a slightly earlier stage, you know. Now we have another story that you're going to tell us tonight, I hope, which I'd like you to introduce and move into the story, please.
Thank you. So this is also a story from when I was training to be a pediatrician. This is something. This is an episode that was probably one of the most shameful episodes for me. When I was a trainee, it was reflective of just sort of being pushed to my limit as a human being, and really pushed by another human being, and losing my composure, and that happens to people. But I think, for me, the physicians that I've always admired are the ones who don't. And you have to learn. You have to learn that it's an acquired skill, because at the end of the day, we're all the same protoplasm, and we get tired, and we get hungry, and we get frustrated, and we get angry sometimes. And how you deal with that, I think, is really what defines you as a professional, and that takes learning, or at least it did for me. So this was called tests. I read somewhere that doctors are the most heavily tested and closely monitored members of society. It begins early in life: high school, midterms and finals, PSATs, SATs, AP tests, and in college, more midterms, more finals. And then you take the MCAT to get into medical school. And once you get into medical school, you take 2 years of science courses, with a final exam after each one that culminates in the first step of your U.S. medical licensing exam, the USMLE, a 2-day tortuous medical multiple choice test that many medical students study for months in order to pass. And then you go through 2 years of clinical rotations, and at the end of each clinical rotation, you take a standardized national test, followed by step 2 of your U.S. medical licensing exam. And then after your residency, you take board exams, and after fellowship, you take subspecialty board exams, and then continuing medical education tests and recertification exams. Doctors are not so much born with silver spoons in their mouths, they're born with number 2 pencils in their hands. So by the time I was ready to go to medical school, I was pretty good at tests. And by the time I was finished with medical school, I was really, really good at tests, or so I thought, because I loved studying medicine. I loved the facts, and I loved the logic, and I loved the language. I loved the vast fact base, what professors would call our fund of knowledge. And by the time I was done with medical school, I never worried about tests. I wasn't afraid of them. I never panicked anymore. I knew how to study effectively. I knew how to dissect questions, and how to ensure that even if I didn't remember the answer, how to reason my way through to it. Now, during residency, despite the fact that you're growing your knowledge base, or your fund of knowledge, at an exponential rate, you don't ever really take written tests. You do monthly rotations. As a pediatric resident, I rotated through the pediatric ICU, the neonatal ICU. I did a month of well baby, adolescent medicine. And at the end of every month, you move on to the next rotation. You don't ever really get tested, not in the number 2 pencil kind of way. By the middle of my second year of residency, I was the junior resident on the cardiology service. Now, when I was in medical school, I had a professor, Dr. Condos, who would tell us that cardiology was the easiest specialty to learn. He'd say, there's a pump, and then there are pipes, and the blood, it flows in one direction. Dr. Condos would also say that nephrology, or the study of kidneys, was the hardest specialty to learn. He'd say, now turning blood into pee, that takes genius. Now, I was never a fan of cardiology, despite Dr. Condos's insistence that it was easy, because the kids with congenital heart defects scared the hell out of me. They were really hard to manage because their deformed and defective hearts were constantly being replumbed or patched, or sometimes replaced altogether. And their heart rates and blood pressures were always so labile, the wild Swings would set off the monitors when they got scared or if something went wrong with their medications. And then their parents would freak out and tell the nurse to call the resident. Kids with a disease called tetralogy of Fallot would sometimes get mad or upset at whatever, and they'd have what we would call a TET spell. They'd turn blue and pass out because of a rapid drop in the oxygen content in their blood. And the parents would freak out and tell the nurse to call the resident. And a lot of these kids were on dozens of medications, powerful medications, which means that every single one would have to be carefully ordered and carefully dosed. And the parents would watch carefully. So if there was a mistake, the parents would freak out, tell the nurse to call the resident. So one night I was the resident on call. And there was a long-term patient on the ward whose mother struck fear in all of our hearts. Even her name belied her nature. Mrs. Goad. Goad. She was a night owl, so she'd stay up late in the evening. She'd read through the progress notes in the chart. And if she saw something that she didn't like or didn't agree with, whatever the hour, she'd tell the nurse to page the resident. Or she'd stay awake and examine the skin of her sleeping child, looking for some new rash or welt or pustule. And if she found one, she'd tell the nurse to page the resident. And when I'd get paged in the middle of the night, I'd shuffle in and do a cursory exam and then have to spend the next half hour telling Mrs. Goad that the pimple that she had discovered on her child's buttock at 2:30 in the morning was unlikely to be the first symptom of a rapidly progressing, life-threatening bacterial infection. And no, I didn't need to work it up. And no, I wasn't going to draw blood cultures and start antibiotics. And no, I really didn't need to call my attending and wake her up and check in with her. And yes, I was, in fact, a licensed physician. And this went on every third night on call, 36-hour shifts. And one night I got a call from the nurse to come and see Mrs. Goad's child. And in that moment, all I could think of was that she was torturing me. She was goading me. And I walked in the room and I saw something that was nothing. And I stormed out of the room and I turned to the nurse and I yelled at her, "Don't you dare page me unless that kid is coding." Think about that. I yelled at a nurse and told her to let me sleep. Don't trouble me with this child or their family until the child's heart stopped and they were about to die. And Mrs. Goad, she was standing in the door 10 feet away. What I had failed to realize was that there were needs that she had that I wasn't addressing. I could leave the hospital the next day at 4 p.m., coffee cup in hand. Mrs. Goad could never leave. She was just as much a chronic patient as her child was. Her prognosis for a healthy life full of joy was just as uncertain as that of her child. And her heart was just as broken and arrhythmic as the heart of her child, buried amidst the scar tissue of his chest. I've taken a lot of tests in my life. I've passed all of them. I've written countless answers to countless essay questions, and I filled in innumerable bubbles on Scantron forms. But this was the test that I failed. And to this day, over 20 years later, I'll always remember the questions that I was asked.
Sorry, I forgot to put my microphone back on. There's always a question that comes to my mind about choosing the specialty of peds. In your case, it's a double question because you had a rough relationship with your dad, and you still went into peds of everything that you could go into, because it just seems to me that if you're if you're a feeling, compassionate, emotional person, that you increase your suffering by choosing peace. Did I how did I say that? Not very well, I think, but you get what I'm getting at.
I think I understand what you're saying. Um, in between college, so when I was in college, I studied philosophy. I was wholly unequipped. Wholly technically unequipped to go to medical school. I think I was academically equipped to deal with the questions that I would encounter, but I was not technically equipped. And so I actually took 3 years off in between college and medical school to take additional courses. And I worked in a hospital and did research, and actually almost all my research was focused on anesthesia. So when I went to medical school, I thought I was going to be an anesthesiologist because I liked the big machines and I liked the very, specific technical nature of the practice of anesthesiology. It just seemed really cool to be able to switch off somebody's everything and get them through a surgery and then switch them back on. I just thought it was that level of control was remarkable. And then I started, did my 2 years of science and medical school. And then I actually did a PhD. So I was out of everything for 4 years. I was totally focused in the laboratory. And by the time I came back to the clinical rotations in medical school, I was, at that point, I was probably 31 years old. And I was a different person than I was when I was an angry teenager, or a teenager angry at my father. I was, somebody who had now worked, and lived independently and worked, for a paycheck, and had spent, essentially 6 years focused on very, very, very small things, and had just changed. So I started through the rotations and actually looked at each one ab initio and said, is this something I could see myself doing? And there were some things that were absolutely like a hard no for me. Surgery was fascinating, but an absolute hard no for me, because at 31, I was like, after 4 hours on my feet or 5 hours on my feet for an operation, I'm like, I'm tired. Like, I can't do this for the rest of my life. This is hard. And I just don't breathe well in masks. Like, I was just not, they'd make fun of me because I'm like a mouth breather in a mask, and it just sounds horrible. OB-GYN, just absolutely wrong place for I think a man to be, or at least this man to be, like, just no. And even my beloved anesthesia was interesting, but I was at that point, 31, really interested in the people that I was taking care of. And the thing about anesthesia is you don't spend a lot of time talking to them; you spend a lot of time attending to them. So when I did pediatrics, I just fell in love with the specialty for a couple of reasons. One is children, even when they're really sick, are not having like a major existential crisis, as opposed to adults. They just want to get better. And they oftentimes have diseases that are really reflective of a much simpler biology, a developmental disease, or, some type of metabolic disorder or the like, a relatively simple infection. And a lot of times they get better because they have brand new hearts and brand new lungs and brand new kidneys and brand new livers, and they've not been abusing themselves with, 50 years of smoking or drinking or bad eating or whatever it is that we do over, the better part of our adulthood. And they're sick, oftentimes never because of anything having to do with their own actions. They're sick because of happenstance or something that is entirely not their fault. And for me, it took it just took anything that would be even remotely judgmental out of the practice of medicine for me. And you were just there to make them better. They just wanted to get better. And I think in the care of children, you just want them to get better. I also like, sort of the educational part of, teaching parents how to, help them care for their child. And the fact of the matter is, most children survive. So it wasn't nearly as depressing as, internal medicine, which I think can be really hard, particularly when you're dealing with people who are dying of, you pick it, coronary artery disease, diabetes, end-stage renal disease. So I liked it. For me, it was joyful. Plus, kids smell better. Like, you put me in a hospital. I'm 55. You put me in a hospital for a week. I like, ew. But you put a kid in the hospital for a week and they still smell delightful. So I just, they have better smelling feet and like. Now I did go on to do pediatric oncology, and that's an entirely different kettle of fish. And I remember
You took the words out of my mouth. I was going to hang you by your own petard, and you did it yourself.
well, but here's the thing, right? So yes, yes, certainly a much higher rate of death, when you're taking care of children with cancer. But the hard facts are that about 70% of children who develop a cancer will go on to survive. It's a remarkable survival rate. And while the lows are incredibly low, and I mean really ridiculously low, hauntingly, so the highs are also equally incredible. The first time that I took care of a leukemia patient, and that, the chemo managed to put that child into remission, and you walk into the room and you tell the parents that their child's in remission, it's the greatest feeling in the world. And again, it's weird because, at the end of the day, I think a lot of times what we do in pediatric oncology is not so much, we don't save lives, we just keep kids from dying from something avoidable. I didn't invent the chemotherapy. I just gave it and made sure that it didn't get screwed up and that your kid didn't get septic along the way. But the parents treat you like you just like rescued their kid from a mine shaft or something like that. But it's pretty amazing. And then to see kids who get through a disease that would otherwise be fatal, that you've helped them sort of along that journey, go on to grow up and survive and thrive. It's pretty remarkable. And so, for me, the price of that feeling of, wow, I helped get a kid through something that would otherwise be lethal, and now they're alive and doing their own thing, or even better, having kids of their own, right? That for me is worth the price of the patients who don't survive. And even in those instances, right? When a child dies of a bad cancer, it's oftentimes not because anybody screwed up. It's because they have a disease we just don't know how to fix. And there was nothing, oftentimes we were going to be able to do to fix that. If you've got a high-grade brain tumor, 8 times out of 10, there's nothing that anybody can do to save your life. All we can do is prolong your life and try and maintain the quality as best as possible. And if you just sort of see the limitations of medicine, you see your limitations as a physician, but you see that what you can do is help the patient make the most of their time, help the family get through it, help relatives and schoolmates and loved ones deal with the remarkable tragedy, then you've done the best that I think anybody can do in a situation like that. If you consider any death a defeat, then yeah, you won't last long in that field. But if you see the ability to maybe not create good, but relieve suffering during the time when people are genuinely suffering, then isn't that what we all aspire to do? Like, if you're in healthcare, isn't that what we're supposed to do as physicians? Is relieve suffering?
I wonder if you would have the same response if you were entering pediatric oncology today versus how many years ago did you enter pediatric oncology?
2004, so 20 years.
2004. So do you have that same response today to pediatric oncology as you would have done in 2004?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah, I don't think, unfortunately, not a lot has changed in pediatric oncology. We're starting to actually, that, to be fair, because I just saw some remarkable data presented today in terms of, the change in long-term survival rates, for pediatric cancer patients. And I think we've made a lot of progress in 20 years. in a number of diseases. There are some that are still recalcitrant. Most pediatric sarcomas, particularly ones that are advanced,
Right.
to treat. Acute
Right.
leukemias are really hard to treat. But even in the 20 years that I've been sort of in this field, there have been measurable improvements in outcomes for patients. But
I mean, it seems to me that that an oncologist today, whether a pediatric oncologist or an adult oncologist, has the opportunity to be so much more creative than they did 15 or 20 years ago, because as you well know, with your biopharmaceutical efforts, the opportunities that are presented when you know so much more about the tumors allow you to move to places that you never thought you might want to go, and to move to medicines that you never thought you might want to go to. And when I look at the field I know best is genitourinary, and when we look at the GU medoncs we love, they're the ones who are just so blinking creative and they don't give up, and they don't go to what is the obvious, but they think, well, maybe this would work, or maybe that would work. And so there's a creativity, a really, really challenging creativity, and applying that to kids even more so.
Yeah, no, I think those are all very fair points. Some of the most remarkable advanced technologies in cancer medicine that I've seen in the past 10 years has been the development of what's called cellular therapy, which is essentially taking normal immune cells out of genetically reprogramming
Right.
them to
Right.
attack tumor cells. And the very first work that was done at Children's Hospital Philadelphia by an incredible scientist named Carl June, who created these things called CAR T cells, chimeric antigen.
Yep.
And the very first that he treated was a young girl named Emily Whitehead, who had multiply relapsed leukemia, really had run out of therapeutic options, was probably weeks or months away from dying. His parents agreed to let her be the first patient on a clinical trial of this novel therapy. And I think she just turned 18 or 19 years old or something like that. I mean, she's been a remarkable long-term survivor. And if that's just not the height of scientific and human ingenuity, just all of the pieces, by the way, to do that, right? Which is, understanding the immunology, the technical ability to make up a completely non-natural gene that is going to create a protein that activates something as complicated as a human T cell and direct it in a certain way, but then to figure out a way to stably put that thing into a T, and then make enough of them and put them into a patient. And I mean, it was a remarkable story. It remains a remarkable story, and one that, frankly, I think reflects what has been for almost 70 years or 80 years now, the innovative nature within pediatric oncology. The very first demonstration of successful treatment of cancer by chemotherapy was done by Sidney Farber in 1948 with a trial with acute.
I mean, one of my most favorite doctors, and compassionate and just a wonderful human being, is Larry Fung, who was the principal investigator for Sipuleucel T and Dendreon, which was another one of these early cellular therapies. And he's on our advisory board, and he's a great guy. You stopped practicing medicine before you started storytelling. Is that right?
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to ask you is how you used your storytelling with your patients, but you didn't, because you didn't start telling stories until you stopped becoming well, you didn't really stop becoming a doctor, but you stopped becoming a clinician. Correct? Is that right? Would you still be a doctor if you were telling stories back then?
Would I be a doctor if I was still telling stories? Would I say
Clinical doctor, a clinician?
Oh, I mean, I made a decision about 15 years ago to go and do focus on drug development, having been scientifically trained as well as clinically trained. I made the decision actually for very personal reasons. It was so that I could have an impact in medicine and science, but also be present as a father for my daughter, which just, I know myself well enough to know that, if I was being if I was still practicing, clinical medicine and taking care of patients, my pager went off, that would always be the first thing that I would reach for. I just know myself. I can't resist the temptation of always wanting to be there for patients. And of course, being a parent, I think you've got an obligation to your family. And for me, the only way that I could sort of balance those things, knowing what my instincts were going to be, was to put the pager down. Would I go back to taking care of patients? In a heartbeat. I would do it in an absolute heartbeat. I do it for free because, for me, it was one of the things that I love doing. I think I like to think that I was good at it. My patients, at least, I was not bad at it. So, but it just brought me such joy. And again, if anything, to do it now at 55, and to continue to learn from the people that I was taking care of, children, parents, family members, brothers, sisters, whatever, and just experience all that. I do that again in a heartbeat. And that's frankly where the inspiration for writing comes from, is, the remarkable people that you encounter along the way, how they deal with, oftentimes what are the worst moments in their lives, and you see remarkable things truly sublimate their tragedy, and then you see remarkably tragic things, and they're all important stories to tell.
So as a storyteller now, would you be a better doctor than you were before?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I do. I think that, but I think that's just, I think you get better in life being a doctor that is teach, the Latin, the word doctor comes from the Latin docere, right? Which is the infinitive to teach. And I think that, at the end of the day, one of the most important things that we do as physicians is really to teach. And the best way to teach is oftentimes through stories. It's not, and this is not new. I mean, grade school teachers have been doing, elementary school teachers have been doing it for as long as we've had elementary school teachers. And in fact, in medicine, we teach very effectively through case studies, which are just essentially stories. So, yeah, I think that being an effective storyteller is a real key skill for any healthcare provider to have. It's just a great communication skill, because as humans, we receive stories well. When you see a story arc, you just sort of naturally want to know where it's going, and you can learn to use that natural human receptiveness towards stories to get a lesson in, to teach someone something that's going to help improve their health.
Well, Dr. Tham, we have flown through this hour. We've heard two wonderful stories. We've got a bunch more questions, but we don't have time for them. I thank you immensely for all the good work you've done for all your patients, for all the good work you're doing now to create new treatments. And hopefully our paths will cross again somewhere before too long. Just a big thank you.
Arthur, thank you very much, and thanks for having me for the past hour. It's been great.
And folks, please don't forget the tip jar. We would all be grateful if you patronize the tip jar. There will be no Solo Arts Heal for the next 2 months because of the holidays, I understand. I haven't looked at the calendar, but our fantastic producer who found Dr. Sam, John Ivory, has. And that's what I see on the sheet here. So we'll see you in January. And thank you, The Marsh. Thank you, Dr. Sam Blackman. Thank you, John Ivory, and thank you, Brianna Caver. And it's a bit early, but I guess I have to say Happy New Year to all. Brianna, back to you.
All right. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Sam. And thank you, everyone who joined us tonight. Please check out our website for more information on our upcoming shows. And as always, don't forget the tip jar. We'll see you next time. Bye.
How do I describe my journey with
your mother who takes care of you, who takes you to the doctor when you're sick. Your mother.
Good morning, New York. Buenos dias. It's me. What's up?
We went out for lunch at a sushi place where she tried sushi for the first time and she liked it.
I see that change can happen. I know things can shift and change for good.
I am dizzily dazzled with stars in my eyes.
same level as I broke my neck. But he's not getting the same return of function I am.
And I don't want any of your smart aleck sex talk that I usually get when I get.
This is beyond the marsh because what you're doing is planting beautiful seeds for artists to grow.